right, I think I'll get started now. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for giving up part of your day to join us again for our webinars on Islamic State. My name is Clina Raleigh. I am the CEO and founder of ACLED, and I will be your moderator today. Due to all the engagement we had for our previous IS series, we decided to have a follow-up, which is our discussion today. And we're really very excited to build on what we discussed in September. And of course, what we discussed in September is also available online if you would like to go through it. We have the same panel of excellent experts, of course, that we had before. And this webinar, which is Tackling the Islamic State in Africa, will focus on state responses and the road ahead, especially in 2026. What we have noticed, of course, is that there's a number of complex patchworks of security partnerships coming up across the continent to deal with the different Islamic State provinces that have been engaging with state forces and, of course, with African civilians. So to walk us all through this, we're really looking at several different areas. We have senior analysts with us, Henny, Lad, and Peter, who will be exploring IS affiliates in the Sahel, the Great Lakes region, and northern Mozambique, respectively. And to help us understand the patterns in Somalia and the Lake Chad Basin, we are joined once again by Mohammed and Miriam from ACLED's Global Data Collection team. So welcome to our excellent panelists. It's lovely to be able to chat with you again. Now, the motivation for this particular discussion, again, it came from our earlier discussion that we had in September, and it was a reflection about how across Africa, governments are facing different Islamic State affiliates, and they've increasingly formed security partnerships to compensate for limited state capacity or just simply the overwhelming amount of violence that dealing with the Islamic State tends to create. So rather relying solely on national military forces, states are building a patchwork of security partnerships, ranging from bilateral military agreements to private military companies, of course, alongside the typical use of local militias. And so what has effectively occurred is that we have a multitude of armed groups working at purposes, of course, to take on the Islamic State. So as we all, I'm sure, know, in the Sahel, Mali has turned to Russian support, initially Wagner, but now the Africa Corps, while Burkina Faso has been using a state-backed Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland to confront the Islamic State Sahel Province, ISSP. Similarly, in both Mali and Niger, they've relied on local self-defense groups and militias in rural areas, with emerging reports, of course, that Mali is being in the process of replicating Burkina Faso's program with the volunteers. So broad regional cooperation between the Sahelian states and the West African states has been strained, of course, from the multiple coups and the political upheavals in the region. So despite a growing threat, not just from IS, but as I'm sure we all know from JNIM's recent encircling of Bamako, there is a lack of solutions and a real continuation of problems. And Henny, of course, will be able to take that on with his excellent work in the region. So around Lake Chad, of course, we have the multinational Joint Task Force, and that has long provided a shared security agreement for the countries within those regions. But Niger's exit in 2025 has undermined the coherence of that body. And also, of course, the fact that they have had several obstacles to success in that region. If anything, of course, what's happening with ISWAP and Boko Haram or groups in the region have really undermined the coherence of that general program. Of course, Nigeria has also increasingly reverted to unilateral operations with local self-defense militias. And Nigeria is in a little bit of a tricky place at the moment, in part because recent interest from the US has suggested that there might be an incursion from those particularly interested in assisting civilian Christians within the country. So much so, in fact, that the IS news source has been warning ISWAP to make sure that they tread carefully in order to not, in fact, encourage incursions by the US government into Nigeria. And so, of course, we'll be seeing how that plays out in the coming months. In Central and Eastern Africa, governments, of course, have leaned heavily on bilateral military cooperation. In fact, sometimes the only thing they do cooperate about. Of course, in DR Congo, there's joint operations between Congo and Uganda against ISCAP, while local militias continue to feel capacity gaps, as is common in the region. Puntland offensives against IS Somalia benefit from Emirati and US backing, while Mozambique's counterinsurgency hinges on Rwanda and Tanzanian forces, which Peter will go into. So taken together, these many trajectories are illustrating a broader trend, which is the first is that African states are increasingly seeking new security partnerships to counter IS affiliates. Most of these are no longer alongside Western militaries, nor do they have a multilateral peacekeeping force with them. And of course, that effectively means that the West is about to become a bit of a spectator rather than an agent when it comes to their engagements within these very, very serious African problems. And of course, too, is that IS clearly is highly adaptable and evolving as a threat on the continent more broadly. It doesn't necessarily need to follow a script in how it embeds itself within different local contexts. And in doing so, of course, states are scrambling to make sure that they have an effective response. And thus far, I think it would be very premature, if not overly positive, to suggest the responses that they've tried have been effective. So for the first part of this webinar, each of our panelists will explore these relationships in more detail and, of course, within the context that they are experts in. But if you have any questions and you would like to pose them, please use the chat, the Q&A, and we will discuss them at the end of this session. With that, of course, I will pass over to Miriam to get us started. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the webinar. So in the Lake Chad region, before the situation with the MNJTF early this year, Niger's exit and Chad's lukewarmness, the individual countries also carried out individual independent operations against insurgents in their countries. However, after MNJTF exited, after Niger exited due to the political situation in the country, its disagreements with ECOWAS and Nigeria especially, Nigeria has had to focus on itself, while Niger's troops are much more focused on regime preservation to ensure that the current regime isn't toppled. And so it has created loopholes where insurgents can attack in Nigeria and then retreat towards the borders, which are porous with little pursuit because of the lack of cooperation between the two countries and their military forces. On the part of Cameroon, who are still part of the MNJTF, there's little support from the Cameroonian troops. It also provides an easy route for escape when insurgents attack in Nigeria and fleeing to Cameroon and vice versa. And so the Nigerian government has taken a more independent approach, like I mentioned earlier. The Nigerian government has developed specialized units and conducts regular exercises, especially for counterinsurgency in the Northeast. We have the Operation Hadinkai that is currently going on. That operation has been on for a number of years now. It has its lull moments, and then it has its high points as well. And then there's the Operation Safe Corridor that is used for rehabilitation of the controversial Operation Safe Corridor that is used for the rehabilitation of former fighters who surrendered to the Nigerian forces. In the last webinar, I talked about ISWAP's tactics, how it has shifted, increasing attacks on military bases and camps, and how the Nigerian government has tried to adapt. And despite all of the losses on the part of the Nigerian military, we've seen an uptick in operations or counterinsurgency operations or military offensives from the military in the last few weeks. And we will say that a lot of that is thanks to the dry season. Now, during the rainy season, it is much more difficult for Nigerian troops to, conduct operations that target the insurgents due to the terrain, lack of equipment that are able to pursue them, even when there's a hit on the Nigerian military. And then the dry season offers a better opportunity for the troops. They're able to conduct offensives, and rather than wait for the insurgents to attack first, the Nigerian troops are able to first attack. And we've also seen a drop in attacks on civilians by the insurgents since then. And so these are some of the operations that the military has been carrying out. The Nigerian military also relies a lot on self-defense groups. We have local militias, vigilante groups, as they are mostly called in the country, and then especially the Civilian Joint Task Force, which is somewhat different from the arrangement of local vigilante groups. The Civilian Joint Task Force is much more organized. They have been supporting Nigerian troops operations for a long time. They consist of locals from the different communities within Borno State, Yobe, and Adamawa. And despite the support of the Civilian Joint Task Force, which the military would say has been very helpful, there are still challenges. The conditions for admitting locals into the Civilian Joint Task Force needs to be much more stringent before they are deployed, so as to ensure their credibility and loyalty. We've had instances where members of the Civilian Joint Task Force are accused of being loyal to the militia, to the insurgents, and are fighting on the side of the Nigerian military just to gain intel to supply to the insurgents. And ISWAP has continued to use fear to terrorize civilians, and this also hampers military operation in the sense that the military relies heavily on human intelligence, and because of how much of the human intelligence the military realized that they need to fight insurgents who are mostly members of the local communities in the region, they created the Civil Military Affairs Department so that the civilians are made aware that the military is on their side and is fighting for them. However, because ISWAP would typically attack villages or civilians who they suspect to have given out intel to the Nigerian government, it has instilled fear. So people are less willing to share intel with the Nigerian military. This has lulled the human intelligence collection for the military, but it doesn't mean that there is still no human intelligence coming or there's no support whatsoever on the part of civilians for the Nigerian military. So ISWAP tries to maintain local control and influence and uses violence to enforce a form of governance in the region. But in all of this, we can see that the military offensives have continued, even in the face of weakened regional cooperation, and then it has relied more on itself since there's no more MNGTF as it used to be for activities in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I really appreciate that. I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions about how Nigeria is planning to face the next year. We're going to turn to Lad, please, to talk about what's happening within the Great Lakes. Thank you, Lad.
Thank you so much. So at present, we can look at Congolese forces sort of relying on two forms of partnership to counter ISCAP. The first, bilateral cooperation with the Ugandan military, and then second, through alliances with various local armed groups. The Ugandan military partnership has by far been the most prolific in the fight against ISCAP, and its current form of cooperation began in the late part of 2021 with the launch of Operation Shuja. At first, this was really just a few hundred Ugandan soldiers, but it quickly grew, and over the past few years, it's kind of ranged month to month between 2,000 and 4,000 soldiers on Congolese soil. But in early 2025, kind of amidst the M23 rapid expansion of territorial control, Uganda reinforced that, and we now have about 5,000 troops within DRC. Much of these operations over the past few years have focused on Beni territory of North Kivu and then Irumu territory of Ituri. But 2024 marked a very broad expansion for Uganda within DRC and really pushed ISCAP westward, creating this sort of effective buffer zone away from the Ugandan border and pushing ISCAP westward. In 2025, we have noticed a slight increase in the number of events within that buffer zone. Most of those have occurred in the Ruwenzori Mountains, which are densely forested and quite rugged, so rather difficult for soldiers to keep ISCAP out of that area. But in general, we have noticed this sort of westward movement, and we've even seen ISCAP move into areas such as Chopo province, which is beyond Uganda's mandate. With all of this, the UPDF have supported the Congolese military, not just through ground operations, but also quite a lot with artillery and airstrikes. Even earlier this year, we saw kind of the way this works as the Ugandan military carried out this 3-day bombardment ahead of ground operations in order to overtake ISCAP's Apakwang camp in Arumu. But the political dynamics with Uganda are a bit fragile. Uganda aims to maintain both a positive relationship with Rwanda as well as with DRC. And that's quite a delicate sort of balancing act right now, as Rwanda backs the M23, while Uganda is also aligned with Congo in the ISCAP operations. So for this, Kampala is definitely walking a very fine line. Turning now to partnerships with local armed groups, while not as prolific in terms of the operations against ISCAP, this practice is really nothing new in DRC. I mean, we could look even at the Congolese military as sort of this loose coalition of armed groups in itself. So the alliance with various local militias and encouragement of self-defense groups is quite a long-standing practice. But what we can look to is in 2024, the military much more openly encouraged communities to work with and build alliances with armed groups, as well as form new local self-defense groups to protect themselves against ISCAP incursions. Much of that was through the recognition that the Congolese military was stretched thin with the M23 rebellion going on. And we also saw this echoed, the sentiment to make these alliances from President Museveni of Uganda, who thought that this would be a helpful way to consolidate gains that the Ugandan military was making. Many of these armed groups are under the broad alliance of the Wazalendo, but we've also seen other self-defense groups emerge. And these have been fairly widespread across the territory where ISCAP operates, in Ituri, North Kivu, and in Chopo so far in 2025. So I think as we see ISCAP move westward out of the sort of mandate of the UPDF, we may see more communities take up arms or form these sort of alliances. The challenge that we have is that these groups often lack the professional training or equipment, instead relying on rather basic rifles or machetes, as well as their advantage of local kind of knowledge of the terrain. But these also come with certain political risks. The groups that the Congolese military is aligning with and sort of deferring operations to sometimes don't work well together. I mean, commonly, the Congolese military works both with the NDCR as well as with the FDLR, but those two groups commonly will contest one another. So these overlapping alliances are not always easy and have created friction between groups. So with that, I think I can hand over to Peter to look at IS in Mozambique.
I'm just going to pop in here 1 second, Vlad, taking some prerogative as a moderator to ask some pretty basic questions about ISCAP, which is that, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the smaller IS groups within the continent at large. And can you explain how it came about in general, given that it's not outside of the Rwenzori Mountains? There doesn't seem to be a particularly active base of potential recruitment there either. So just the origin story there as a new actor in an already extremely complex and conflicted environment.
Yeah, the group really maybe is unique in some ways in that it developed as a Ugandan rebel movement with sort of leaders in the 1980s and early 1990s coming together within Uganda, eventually being expelled and kind of settling within kind of the Beni area of Eastern DRC as the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF. So the group had carried out different forms of violence and allied with various groups through the Congo Wars. but maintained different kind of ideologies as a Ugandan rebel group, and kind of focusing on carrying out violence against the regime in Uganda. And then later, sort of around 2017, 18, and 19, we saw much more alignment with the Islamic State, a change of leadership, which then kind of brings us more to the current kind of ideological underpinnings of ISCAP that emerged from the ADF.
Perfect. Thanks very much. It's nice to understand that in context of the already troubled region. And now we turn to Peter for Mozambique. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks, Lad. What I want to do is just to highlight some progress that there's been in terms of the state response to Islamic State Mozambique, and also just highlight some of the challenges that will be faced in the coming years. Finally, the positive thing is that we finally, in the last almost 2 years, have a sort of a settled assemblage of state forces ranged against Islamic State Mozambique. The first 3 years of the conflict they were marked by drift on the part of the state. The counter-terror response was led by the police for the first 3 years with ad hoc support from private military contractors, at least 3, and certainly including the Dyke Advisory Group and the Wagner Group for a brief period of time. In 2021, the leadership of the response was transferred to the military, the Defense Armed Forces of Mozambique, FADOM, which likely helped facilitate the game-changing intervention of the Rwandan and SADC forces that came later that year, which significantly reduced the threat presented by the Islamist insurgency. Currently, we still have FADOM leading operations on the ground, with a much reduced role for the police's paramilitary wing. Despite the withdrawal of SADC, Tanzania still maintains about a bilateral force on the Mozambican side of the border as well as on their own side of the border, primarily focused on border security and ensuring that the conflict doesn't spill over into Tanzania's southern regions. Domestically, there's been some progress. The government has successfully incorporated into the security forces the communal defense militias that had emerged in the early years of the conflict, now known as the local force. They play a valuable role in some communities, given their local knowledge, but do note that they are not active in all communities and that they arose from local level Frelimo structures, Frelimo being the ruling party, and are not active in areas where the insurgency is strongest and where Frelimo is quite weak. President Daniel Shapo has also pointed to the need for fundamental security sector reform just in the first couple of months of his administration, and the need to address corruption in procurement, corruption in appointments that has hindered the state's response to the insurgency, including the selling of operational information to the insurgents, which is quite remarkable. They actually mentioned that. This leaves Rwanda, which in many ways is most important of the state forces, which are up to 5,000 troops in the province, mostly RDF, but also drawn from Rwanda National Police. Rwanda is facing challenges. In the first 2 to 3 years of the conflict, of its intervention, it was a relatively popular force with the people in the province. It had been effective in tackling Islamic State Mozambique and had a clear civil-military cooperation strategy that helped underpin good relations with communities and probably contributed to good intelligence gathering. But that is changing. Last year, we documented how Rwandan forces are reluctant to respond to Islamic State Mozambique's attacks on civilians in some areas, even in areas where they have established bases and outposts. That continues and is affecting how people view the force. We see the effects of this in the town of Musimba de Praia. Despite the Rwandan forces having their headquarters there, Islamic State in Mozambique is increasingly free to regularly move in and out of the town. In early October, armed men entered the town to preach in a mosque. That was highly publicized through Islamic State media channels and just through local clips made by people who were in the mosque. And just this week, they entered again to take to the bush two of the children of Islamic State Mozambique's military commander, Farida Soleimani. So clearly there is a level of support for the group in the community. So these signs of emerging legitimacy for the group, not just in Musimba de Prague, may be what prompted President Chapo to raise the prospect of dialogue with the insurgents in late September. Now, while dialogue with IS groups is not unprecedented, we've seen it, good examples of it in Nigeria at local level. The proposal of it by a head of state may be quite unprecedented. So what shape that dialogue would take is an open question. It'll certainly be very informal, but mean that over the next 4 to 5 years, during which the liquefied natural gas project will continue to be under construction, and for that time you'll definitely have Rwandan forces on site, it makes it very worthwhile keeping an eye on developments in Mozambique. Thank you. And
Thanks very much, Peter.
I hand over to Henny.
Thank you for joining today's conversation. So I'm going to speak about the Islamic State Sahel province, operating primarily in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Nigeria increasingly, or more recently, they have become much more active there. The state's primarily affected by the ISSP threat, primarily respond through military and security operations, both unilaterally and through occasional coordination between the three so-called IES states, or part of the alliance of Sahel states. Although Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they have now announced the creation of a joint force called Unified Force of the Alliance of Sahel States, although it's still very nascent since it was announced in early October. Mali has also received support from Russian partners, initially the Wagner Group, and which subsequently transitioned to the Africa Corps. And where state presence is limited, these states have also relied heavily on local militias, for instance, in Burkina Faso, the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, but also in Mali and Niger, there are ethnic and community-based militias, particularly operating in remote areas of these countries. However, it's necessary to kind of highlight that the main bulwark against ISSP expansion has been its jihadist rival, JNIM, or Jama Nusratul Islam wal Muslimin. These groups, they fought intensively between each other between 2020 and 2023. However, more recently, they have prioritized fighting state forces and their allied militias instead of each other. However, as we speak, ISSP just launched an offensive against JNIM in northeastern Burkina Faso, especially since JNIM has expanded a bit in ISSP territory in the Seno province. Moreover, in Mali, ISSP has really consolidated influence or control in Mali's Menaka region, and that is except for the regional capital of Menaka town itself. And that town has a very strong presence of the Malian Armed Forces, the Africa Corps, but also local militias such MSA and Gatia. And if any efforts have been conducted against the group, it has been primarily through drone strikes targeting the group's strongholds in Akabar, in Araban, and Tabankot, which really are localities in the same general area of southern Menaka on the border between Mali and Niger. And as a result of that, many of these drone strikes have been perpetrated by Nigerian forces because the threat really is something that affects northern Tillaberi in particular. And some, how could you say, punctual or sporadic operations have also resulted in the killing or capture of a few commanders and senior members of the group. However, it's really kind of the aerial operations that have taken the front seat in the efforts of Sahelian states. However, if we're going to speak about some of the successes of the Wagner Group before transitioning to Africa Corps, it was putting also pressure on the Gao Ansongo Labesanga axis, which really is the main road leading from the city of Gao in Mali to the capital of Niamey in Niger, and that has triggered defections in the ranks of ISSP. One of them, a particular commander named Ubel Borema, along with men loyal to him. And in addition to that, it has also been some friction between factions within the ISSP, which has resulted in occasional clashes and some internal tensions. However, this has not contributed to any broader fragmentation, but rather very kind of localized tensions, which is also something that is not maybe unusual for a group that is of the size of ISSP, which also have a very kind of large geographic scope, currently operating across 4 countries. But also shifting focus a little bit more to Niger, because even though not as affected as Mali and Burkina Faso in terms of the level of violence, it has demonstrated a certain degree of fragility since the 2023 coup with the ousting of President Bazoum. And this has led to, for instance, militiamen in northern Tillaberi, especially in the Banibango area, to defect to ISSP. And this is quite recent development in some way, but it's also because Banibango is located very close to ISSP strongholds on the Malian side of the border. And at the same time, during a recent attack in Banibango, the group didn't target any civilians. And it was basically a significant factor in that was that the defecting militiamen demanded that civilians won't be targeted when they conducted the attack. So that is quite interesting itself, that it has raised certain internal conversations within the group, especially since it has become more engaged in form of rudimentary governance in some parts of its areas of operations. And yeah, I think it also reflects like the continued military pressure by ISSP and the ongoing fragility of the Nigerian state. It is really stretched thin due to the multiple fronts engaged on. It has the Lake Chad Basin, Boko Haram insurgency, threats from the border along Libya, and also the Sahelian insurgency, alongside banditry on the border with Niger. But combined, ISSP continues to operate as a very coherent force. This year, it has embarked on a kidnapping campaign targeting foreigners. It also increasingly directs its operations towards population centers. Recent US citizen kidnapping in Niamey kind of speaks to that, but also coordinated attacks in and around the town of Tillaberi, but also that it is entrenching itself in the borderlands between Benin, Niger, and Nigeria. And with that, I'm passing over to my colleague, Mohammed, who will speak about Somalia.
Thanks so much, Hani. Mohammed?
Hi, everyone. As we have spoken previously and on our last webinar on IS in Africa, we have talked about IS expansions and activities in Somalia. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about the responses from the Puntland administration and support from the international military partners. Amid the resurgence of IS Somalia province, Puntland administration, a semi-autonomous state within Somalia, launched an operation codenamed Hila, targeting Islamic State Somalia province, who are operating in the Al-Miskat mountain range in Bari region. This operation started as a result of the expansions and the threat of IS, which have been growing for the past years, especially from 2023 and 2024. And due to the offensive launched by Puntland, they have recovered over 600 strongholds and villages from IS Somali province, including their strongholds where their leaders were being occupied for several years, especially Shabab and Turmasale which has been a coordination center for the Al-Qarar office. This operation was supported by the United States in cooperation with the federal government of Somalia, and also was supported by the United Arab Emirates with their relations with Puntland administration. And this operation tested the administration's ability and capacity to fight alone with IS Somalia, and they have shown how IS Somalia growing influence in the region is, according to the areas they have went and the documents and what they have recovered during this operation. This operation, and in the country, we believe this operation is one of the most successful operation by Puntland, and this was as a result of the U.S. Partnership through their support in logistics and trainings, and as well as their air support and also ground operations to the Puntland forces. The U.S. conducted more than 40 airstrikes targeting IS leaders, strongholds, and affiliates, armed dealers in Somalia. These airstrikes play a huge role in the advancement of the ground force operation towards IS strongholds. And recently, last week, most recently, Puntland administration announced the completion of the last phase of the operation, and to the statement they were putting, saying that they have cleared more than 80% of areas controlled by IS, and the operation is in last concluding state. On the other hand, we are seeing movement by the data is showing there's a huge number of movement of IS in Somalia, and coming back to areas they have lost in February, March, and still regrouping. So if the operation ends, that means that they have high chances of regrouping and continuing their operations in the area. In the previous webinar, I also mentioned their expansions towards other districts in Bari region, and their high likelihoods from the data we have, it shows that the movement is going from Khandala district towards Alula and towards Bosaso area. And these areas, if the operation stops, it means that there are high chances of regrouping, even becoming stronger, because this is the first of its kind operation they have faced in their 10 years of existence in Somalia. They have celebrated their 10 years in October 2025, and it shows that the response from the Puntland administration and their support allies was good enough. But if it ends, it will give them a chance to regroup. On the other hand, the U.S., in partnership with the federal government of Somalia, have been supporting this operation with the air and ground operations, which has been very successful with their latest airstrikes early as last week. And we are seeing upward trend of IS movements towards all coastal areas in the Bari region, especially areas used by human smugglers, and especially a place name called Alayo, which is modern day Somaliland, and Marero. These two are strategic areas where smugglers are using to smuggle out people from Somalia, and it is the route they're using to bring more fighters from the Middle East so far. And IS in Somalia is, in terms of the operation, is being weakened. If the operation ends, they have the chances to resurge and become more lethal than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's extremely helpful. And in fact, it's been very informative to hear from everybody. I have a series of questions, one for each person, that I've gleaned from the comments. And of course, we'll try to address every question. If not here, then certainly over other communications, if that's possible. I'm going to start actually with Henny. And Henny, there's about 20 questions in there just for you about individual attacks, but I want actually to ask you a very direct question about, can you tell us of any successful negotiation there has been yet with IS, or any particular state action that has mitigated IS violence, that has engaged with IS or limited IS in Africa or elsewhere?
Mention an example in the region of Gao, for instance, the main transit route between Gao and Labasanga. It has been really a focal point of IS violence in Mali, and both the efforts of the Malian armed forces with support from Wagner has really kind of contracted those or mitigated those activities. But more broadly, yeah, I think others are better in a better position to speak about other affiliates. But in the Sahel, a few commanders have been neutralized or killed, and some senior members captured in the Menaka region as the result of very punctual or sporadic operations. But I would underscore that there hasn't been any major offensive. So ISSP has been able to kind of evolve relatively freely in Menaka, but also parts of Tillaberi and Tawa, and similarly to their expansion more southward into northwestern Nigeria. So yeah, they haven't been dislodged, and that is maybe the biggest shortcoming.
Thanks very much. There's just been some quite sobering reading recently. And of course, as Peter mentioned, the corruption within several governments, coupled with some of the great expense that comes with having Wagner or Africa Corps in a country, means that quite a lot of state resources are either taken or there's impunity for violence amongst others, and that is not necessarily dealing with the problem. So there's several issues relating to it, and that was from a question by Sophia. Peter, I'm going to turn to you now, and it's about, what does a successful negotiation with ISIS look like? And of course, somebody else asked about community support for ISIS in Mozambique. So is this a reaction to community support, or is it a reflection of state incapacity to deal with the violence? Oh, sorry, you're muted. Sorry. Thanks.
Pardon me. I thought the question might be about that, so I was trying to make notes on it. It's at very, very early days. The president has mentioned it. The provincial commissioner has mentioned it. And mentioned it in sort of more positive ways than Chapo's predecessor Newsy did. I'm sort of a little aware of efforts being made to establish communications between different elements of the state and the insurgency, and that sort of ongoing. But what are the objectives, and what do you actually discuss? I actually don't know. We'd need to consider firstly the objectives of the state, and I say this, I use the term state loosely because you're not really sure which bit of the state you're talking about when these communications are taking place in Mozambique. But is the objective to split the group? Is the objective to try and identify issues which the group can concede that may allow for some settlement to be reached? Hard to see that, because I don't think that they're not sort of, for example, they're not strong enough to hold territory as such, even in bits of the province where they are active and moving freely. They don't really control it. They don't control access in and out. They don't control taxation. They don't control. They don't control much. They just create problems. So it's really it's a question of what is the objective of the state? Are they trying to split the group? or are they trying to negotiate with it as a whole? And then on the side of Islamic States, as to whether there would Islamic State Mozambique, as to whether there would be a willingness for all to go together. That's difficult. They've done very well in maintaining the sort of collegial leadership that they've had in place since 2017, which is relatively flat structure, but that was certainly put considerable strain on it. So yeah, it's early days and very difficult to know what it might entail, but there are definitely signals being sent and messages being sent as well, literally.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'm going to turn to Mohammed now, and it was about, from your presentation, it seemed like this was one of the unique situations in which attacks on IS were relatively successful, potentially because of the role that the US played. And what do you foresee in 2026 as the interest or sustaining the interest of the US in handling what is becoming an evolving problem within IS, within Somalia? And then in addition to that, can you give a sense of for what IS relates, well, what IS says are its ranked enemies or priorities in Somalia, so that we can get a sense of what they're actually trying to do other than staying alive in an already very fraught context? Thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. And as I mentioned that earlier this month, the Putin administration announced that this is the final phase of the operations, and they have started withdrawing some of the forces from the front lines. And on the other hand, we have seen massive regroupment of IS in the areas that they have been areas of operation. And as late as earlier this week, we have seen local support offered to IS. So you can look at this way that if the operation ends in 3-4 months, and IS will research, we are seeing indications that they are receiving local support from the local communities in terms of financial support, and zakat in terms of animals have already started, and the operation is on its final stage. If Puntland and the international partners, especially the USDA and the federal government, don't come up with strategic operations to continue this strategic plans to continue the operation, IS will the threats will be seen again, and they will be expanding from Puntland. On the second question, IS want to control Puntland and Somaliland, because in the southern part, the Shabab are there, which they are a fierce enemy, and Shabab has lots of manpower than the IS. They have lots of different strategies, and their main thing is to restore Islamic Sharia law in the regions they are. And one of the reasons that is not giving them the opportunity to expand is not the operations by the government. It is Shabab elements that are present in the areas they are fighting. Shabab are present in the Al Madou mountain, that is starting from Bosaso towards eastern part of Arigabo, Senag, Somaliland, and they are also in the southern part, southern central part of Somalia. Had it not been Al-Shabaab presence in those areas, you could have seen an IS that is more expanding. And they are also concentrated in the Bari region because their leader comes from the area. He comes from the local community. He has the support of the local community, and he has not expanded beyond his tribal or kinsmen, because the south they are not more prominent, but they are more prominent in the south towards Arigabo and towards the Sol and Senag region areas. All those areas IS is planning to expand to it, but there are factors like the Shabab factor and the government factor.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. That's a really nice jump to a question for Lad, which is, to what degree, in a situation like Eastern Congo, is ISCAP one of many and potentially interchangeable with the other active groups in the region? So, I mean, will it have an opportunity to monopolize that space as we've seen other groups within Congo do? And if so, what will be the intention that they would be using to propel themselves into that position?
Yeah, I think in some ways they are certainly one group among dozens of other armed groups fighting in the same region. But there's certainly some unique things about ISCAP that make them quite different. I think what we see from other groups are willingness to form alliances either with adjacent armed groups or with the Congolese military, whereas the modus operandi of ISCAP is largely to operate alone. Even though there were sort of rumors of potential cooperation with Codeco, and potentially they have operated alongside some Lendu militias at various points this year. That's still very much the exception rather than the rule. So I think in the sense that they operate quite independent from others is one factor that I think sets them apart. The Islamists' ideology, as well as their connections with IS Central, have also made them somewhat unique to the other groups in the region. I mean, there are other armed groups, M23 being the most notable, that have connections outside of the country and are able to supply various support to the group. But ISCAP is one of relatively few that do enjoy that same level of support. And then something that is also maybe notable of ISCAP is their focus on the targeting of civilians. They target civilians to a level unlike any other group in Eastern DRC. They tend to publicize these attacks quite widely, and it makes their way on, increasingly makes its way onto IS Central media. But their brutality against civilians, completely decimating and often burning towns after they've looted and abducted civilians is something that's a signature of violence for ISCAP.
Thanks very much, Lad. I really appreciate that. It's very similar, of course, to a paper that Henny and I wrote many years ago, and when we were reflecting on it almost 10 years ago, Henny, I think. Miriam, I have one question left for you before turning to some more general ones, and that is, of course, there has been a very public attack by JNIM into Nigeria, and I'm wondering about how this is being relayed within the Nigerian state, in part because, of course, as I was just saying, in previous work that we've done with Henny, the only thing that was really containing both of these groups was each other rather than the state itself. And to what degree is there concerns that whether it's ISWAP or Ansaru or JNIM or others, that it's not a problem that's handleable by the Nigerian state, despite the fact that it's got quite a formidable military presence?
So at the moment, the Nigerian state does not, I would not say that there a new group coming up is of a challenge of some sorts, because currently we have groups in Kwara State, we have Ansaru in the North Central, and there's been so much of it, and they are usually just considered like one and the same thing with different branches. So it's like one tree and many branches, and will definitely be handled like or treated, considered to be one of the other insurgent groups. So that's the way the Nigerian state would look at the situation and not necessarily panic and see it as a new attack or something different. I mean, the Nigerian military, I would say, is experienced, even though the handling of the situation isn't the best, but they have actually shown some sort of, expertise in dealing with the situation. And I'm sure that the Jenim situation or the Jenim attack would, follow suit. But I'm sure Henny would speak better to Jenim, since it's an offshoot from the ISSP.
Thanks, Henny. You are welcome to the last word on what works.
Yeah, I think the geography is quite important here when speaking about northwestern and western Nigeria. It is an area which has not very dense security presence. And I think both Sahelian groups and Nigerian groups have, found these areas as like having the just right conditions. So that is something that I think is important to underline, because there is a presence of ISSP in Sokoto and Kebbi states, and you also have various affiliates, including Ansaru, JNIM, but also ISWAP and others that have kind of infiltrated or established a presence in Niger State, Kwara State, and so forth. It is to be seen how the Nigerian forces or military will respond to that, but still, they have been able to kind of establish a presence and also entrench themselves over, the past few years.
Thanks very much. And of course, I think that in our next webinar, whenever that is, I'm sure it'll be in the new year, we can maybe address what about Africa is uniquely suited to this stage of IS's overall development, and what we'd be looking at in 2026. Because it certainly seems like they are on a little bit of an expansion streak, certainly that they've managed to evolve in several different contexts. A recent piece we wrote with, of course, Henny wrote on some of these militias that are operational in the Sahel, I think will be very interesting reading for people, because of course, as we've expressed in all of these engagements, local militias often constitute quite a front line or a large component of the security partnerships that are developing within countries. And that comes with a number of its own complications. But I wanted to thank everybody for their attention today and for their patience as we went on a little bit of a whirlwind tour across African countries. It's a very, of course, pressing and serious subject within the continent, and we will certainly be continuing to keep our eye on it. As I mentioned about the questions, we'll try to make sure that everybody gets responses. We really appreciate you coming to listen to our discussions today, and thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.